Welcome back to TFT Central. Today we're going to be taking you through the best settings for the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCDP. This is their dual mode 480Hz model. If you want the best settings for the PG32UCDM, the QD OLED model, those are linked in the description below as well, along with the reviews for both screens. We're going to set the screen up in SDR and HDR usage. You can use these for PC input, consoles, or any other device. We'll also go through the OLED Care options and a few of the other settings. So we've opened up the main menu. First thing we're going to do actually is to come into the OLED Care menu, because there's a couple of things here that will influence some of our later settings. So you'll see by default that the screensaver, screen move and auto logo brightness are all enabled by default. We'd recommend leaving as many of these on as possible to help with the mitigation of image retention and burn-in. But if you do find any of them problematic or annoying during your usage, then you can turn them off here. Screensaver will just auto dim the screen when it detects prolonged static content. That's worth leaving on. The screen move we find a bit distracting, so we're actually going to turn that down to the light setting here, just to minimize the occurrences of the screen shifting from side to side. Auto logo brightness we'll leave turned on as well. That will just dim static HUD elements and other logos and that kind of thing. So we'll leave those three things turned on. We'll come back out into the system menu as well. There's a couple of things you want to change here. If you need additional power delivery from the USB-C connection for a laptop or another connected device, then you can change that here up to 90 watts, but it will severely restrict your maximum brightness setting. So we'd only recommend doing that if you're going to need to specifically use the higher power delivery. Proximity sensor is turned off by default. We're going to turn that on. That will detect when the screen is no longer being used by a person and just turn it off. So that's another useful measure for helping to avoid image retention and burn-in. You can turn the power indicator light off here if you want to. The other setting, just to check that you've got enabled, is HDMI CEC. That will auto switch over to the HDMI input when it detects a device being powered on, like a console or something, so that's quite useful. So with those settings enabled, we're going to set the screen up now for SDR usage, and we're going to do that via the image and the color menu. In the image menu, we're going to turn the uniform brightness mode on. That will help ensure that you've got a nice consistent brightness regardless of your window size, your content, your APL. That's really useful for desktop and office applications. Contrast and blue light and vivid pixel can be left on the defaults. We're going to change the brightness setting though. We're going to move that down to a setting of 40 to deliver you a luminance of around 120 nits. You could also set that to 52 for 150 nits or to 73 for 200 nits. We're going to set that down at 40 for 120 nits for now. If you've disabled the screensaver or the logo dimming feature in the OLED Care menu, then you might want to lower this by another 4% in total, so 2% for each of those settings, because they do have a small impact on the brightness of the screen. So for instance, if you want 120 nits and you've turned those two things off, then set this at 36 instead of 40. In the color menu, for now we're going to leave the color space set on its full wide gamut. We're going to change the color temp mode to user, and we're going to set RGB at 100 for red, 99 for green, and 97 for blue. That should return you a white point very close to 6500 Kelvin. There's no need to change saturation, 6-axis saturation, or gamma, but just check that gamma is set to 2.2, which is the default. So this is the screen set in its wide gamut mode, which will give you a more vivid and colourful looking image, but it won't be as accurate for sRGB content. If you're just gaming, or you're using the screen for multimedia, or you don't mind the more colourful looking image, then just leave it on wide gamut, that's fine. You can also find our calibrated ICC profile in the description below, which is set for the wide gamut mode, but will clamp the colour space back to sRGB for colour aware applications. So you might want to check that out as well if you're going to run it in the wide gamut mode. If you want to work more accurately with sRGB content or reduce the saturation, then you can switch simply here to the sRGB color space mode. We think this is the best way to operate the sRGB color emulation, by the way. You don't need to change the color temp or the brightness or any of the other settings. Those can all stay the same. You can just quickly and easily switch between sRGB and wide gamut mode here. We've now enabled HDR in Windows. You can see that the screen switches into its HDR mode here. We would recommend only enabling HDR in Windows when you're actually going to view HDR content. So if you're going to view an HDR game or a movie or something, that's fine, but don't leave it enabled all of the time. In HDR mode, you'll see that a lot of the sections are now unavailable by default. The main thing you're going to want to change is to come into the image section, the HDR setting, and you'll see by default that it's set to the HDR 400 True Black mode. Now that's the most accurate in terms of its EOTF tracking, but it doesn't get very bright at all. And so we think that most users will want to switch to one of the other three modes here. We're going to switch to Gaming HDR first of all. We found the gaming, cinema and console modes to all be pretty similar during our testing, so we'll use the Gaming HDR mode for now, and this will by default be much brighter than the HDR 400 True Black mode. The other thing you might want to do is change this adjustable HDR setting here, enable that, and you'll see that now the settings for brightness and contrast and other settings, the colour menu, are now available. If you want an even brighter HDR experience, then just bump this up to 100. This is a little bit less accurate than the Gaming HDR mode by default, but we would expect most people to find this preferable for a more impactful and a brighter HDR experience overall. Move that up to 100. Then in the colour menu, you can leave this set on the user mode that we configured earlier, and there's no real reason to change anything else in there. So the main thing would be to switch to the Gaming HDR mode, enable adjustable HDR, and then bump the brightness up to 100. We expect most people will prefer that configuration. So that's the screen setup for both SDR and HDR usage. If you found this video useful, please give us a quick like below. Don't forget to hit subscribe to stay up to date on future reviews and other monitor content as well. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.